tell me about the constitution of the Spartans, Historia Civilis, or rather the constitution. Oh wait, no, I got that right. So, hey guys, so we're gonna be watching, today and tomorrow, we're gonna be watching the constitutions of Sparta and Athens. And I just want to quickly talk about what I know about the Spartans. I mean, a lot of what I'm going to talk about probably won't even come up in the video, but, basically, I guess what I know about Sparta is that they were, a very heavily militaristic society, to put it nicely. Things I've heard, they had a huge slave population. Like, the majority of the people working were slaves. The men were believed to, again, I'll probably get things wrong, so be a little kind to me, but, essentially the men were bred for war, being in the military and whatnot, and they had, like, a lot of slaves, essentially, doing all the other work. I don't know about the exact number, but, yeah, so, like, the majority of, like, the population were the slave class, and the Spartans were known not to treat them kindly. At least from some sources I read, they did not treat them kindly, which is insane because you're essentially outnumbered. But either way, yeah, a lot of slavery. And which is funny because like movies like 300, the Spartans are fighting for freedom from the Persians, even though the Spartans had so much slaves. But oh, and speaking of 300, that's probably the most famous example, at least I can think of, like, modern times, of what probably modern people know about the Spartans, though obviously it's based on a graphic novel by Frank Miller and whatnot, and, obviously, and I think another big event regarding Sparta is the Battle of Thermopylae, obviously, where they made their heroic last stand. Them and some Greek allies essentially held off for about 3 to 4 days around there. And overall, yeah, King Leonidas, probably the most famous Spartan king. And then I think there's the Peloponnesian War, I believe it's called, where Sparta and Athens battled. And yeah, I think Sparta definitely is one of the bigger Greek city-states. It's usually Sparta and Athens are usually seen as the two big ones, or at least the ones I've noticed that are talked most about. And yeah, overall, I'm not sure what we're in for this video. I'm assuming, like, yeah, again, we're probably gonna break down some Spartan society. Mainly the men were bred to be in the military for war, and some of their training regimens were insane. Like, they were a very hardcore society, to put it nicely. Like, if what I've heard is true, then yeah, Spartan training was, boy, yeah, these guys were bred to be very, very tough. And what else? Oh yeah, I think Spartan women, I've heard that Spartan women had more freedom compared to women from other places, and to what that entails specifically, I'm not sure, but, Also, the Spartans were known for their wit. I think one of the most famous examples I remember is when, like, King Philip of Macedon was like, hey, will I be accepted if I go to your city as friend or foe? And they said neither. And then Philip made threats towards it. Like, if I get there, I'm gonna completely wreck you. And the Spartans just said if. So they had a lot of wit to them. I think that's funny, too. I just remember that story off the top of my head, Okay, we should probably get to the video. I'm sorry. I was just trying to spiel about what I knew or kind of have heard about the Spartans. And, yeah, we should probably get to it. Let's learn about the constitution of the Spartans.
It occurred to me one day that Sparta, though among the most thinly populated of the states, was evidently the most powerful and most celebrated city in Greece, and I fell to wondering how this could have happened. But when I considered the institutions of the Spartans, I wondered no longer. So begins the seminal text called the Constitution of the Spartans, written by a guy called Xenophon in the early 4th century BCE. Xenophon was a native Athenian who was allowed to live with the Spartans for several years, leaving us the best surviving account of the Spartan way of life. If not for Xenophon, we would know very little of their strange customs. What were these strange customs? Basically, ancient Sparta configured their entire society to maximize military proficiency at all costs. Their incredible discipline and their ability to mobilize their entire male population allowed this tiny city to become the dominant land power in Greece. Their Greek contemporaries spoke the same language and worshipped the same gods, and yet they all looked at Sparta like they were from another planet. So what do we know about Spartan institutions, and why did Xenophon consider them the source of Spartan strength? Sparta was a diarchy. That means that they had 2 kings from 2 royal families who were equal in power, operating in parallel. According to Sparta's founding myth, Heracles himself came from across the sea with his supporters, conquering the land that would later become Sparta and enslaving the local Greek population. He then gifted this land to 2 of his descendants, the twins Eurysthenes and Procles. Their descendants would go on to found the Aegeid and Eurypontid royal dynasties, who together would rule the city for the next 700 plus years. So according to the story that they told themselves, the Spartans were foreign occupiers. This was central to the Spartan identity, so central that they viewed every non-Spartan as a potential threat. This even applied to their own slaves. The descendants of the original enslaved Greeks were called the Helots. The Helots outnumbered the Spartans at, well, we don't know. I've seen 3 to 1, I've seen 7 to 1, either way, a lot. Because of this, the Spartans lived in a state of constant anxiety that the enslaved Greeks would one day get their act together and
Yeah, I've heard about that. A while ago, like I said in the beginning of this video, I had heard that obviously the slave population was much larger than, the regular Spartans, and the Spartans didn't treat them well. Like, at least from the sources I was reading, like apparently they were claiming that like the Spartans weren't that kind to them. So I'm like, that's kind of like poking the bear, right? Or like kicking the dog. Eventually, the dog bites back or something like that principle. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I don't know why you want to, like, it's weird, like, a society like this. I'm like, why would you want to do this? I don't know.
Rise up against their foreign overlords. The Spartans held it as almost an article of faith that if their city ever fell, the killing blow would be delivered by a Helot rebellion. So why did they tolerate the constant stress that came with the domination of the Helots? Well, this large-scale enslavement produced a massive amount of wealth. When each Spartan male reached adulthood, the city of Sparta awarded him with an allotment of public farmland and a contingent of Helot slaves to work it. The wealth that each farm generated was enough to basically turn every Spartan citizen into a landed aristocrat. In other words, they were so rich that nobody had to work for a living. And yet, even with all of this free public farmland subsidizing the Spartan lifestyle, private property still existed. Why does this matter? Because Spartan inheritance law was so radical that it terrified everybody else in Greece. Stick with me. When a Spartan man died, his public allotment of farmland went back to the state, but his private property went to his wife. Not his son, his wife. This may seem like a small difference at first, but consider this. Husbands dying young was an extremely common occurrence in such a militarized society. Many of these women who had inherited their husband's wealth would devote the rest of their lives to taking their small fortunes and turning them into large ones. Eventually, when these wealthy women died, their land would pass equally to their male and female children. This is the radical bit. Now imagine a rich young woman with inherited wealth marrying an equally rich young man. If that young man died in battle, which happened a lot, his wife would inherit his entire estate and go from rich to ultra rich. Then she had her whole life ahead of her to expand her wealth even further and pass it on to her sons and daughters.
Oh my, that's so interesting. You know, usually we hear, like, in certain societies and parts of history, you know, when guy dies, usually try to pass it to the son or the next male relative. But that's interesting that the, you know, wife or the women inherit. That's something I haven't heard of yet, you know? And, like, yeah, it just keeps going, so it's like, everyone's like freaking Elon Musk here. If you build it up enough, it seems like, assuming nothing goes wrong, it seems like you can just, like, you know, just be ultra rich. Everyone's, like, you know, millionaires. Well, I know currency's different, but, like, I don't know.
In other words, rich women tended to produce more rich women. These rich women married rich men, and during periods when lots of husbands died young, this created a snowball effect. These ultra-rich women are sometimes referred to as the Spartan heiresses. Aristotle wrote that in his time, nearly 40% of all Spartan territory was owned and administered by a small group of extremely wealthy women. Their wealth dwarfed every other Spartans by orders of magnitude, including the 2 Spartan kings. They were a political constituency unto themselves.
Wow, that is so unique. That, yeah, I had heard that, like, women in Sparta compared to other places had a lot more power and whatnot. I didn't know specifically what that meant, but to see it now, it makes sense. That is so interesting.
I want to drive this point home. At times, some of the most powerful men in Sparta, even the kings, were completely dependent on loans from the Spartan heiresses. Their influence was immense. Periodically, politicians in Sparta would start talking about land reform, and every time the Spartan heiresses would block it by flooding the system with money and buying off politicians. The rest of Greece was horrified that such a small group of women had such a tight grip on Spartan politics. Aristotle complains at length about how wealthy Spartan wives tended to dominate their less wealthy husbands, and that the entire population of women had been ruined by their, quote, intemperance and luxury, unquote. To me, intemperance and luxury just sounds like they were having a good time.
Sorry Aristotle, I'm gonna have to disagree with you. I respect the hustle. In a system like that, you have a lot to gain. Like, you know what? I respect the hustle, ladies. You made your money. I'm wondering if some women ever, like, wanted their husbands to die now. Because, like, surely they were aware of this, right? Being like, hopefully he dies soon. Like, yeah, I think I just described gold diggers in a sense, right? Were a lot of Spartan women gold diggers? No, I'm joking. I'm kidding around, guys. But yeah, you gotta respect the hustle. And I guess they were mainly horrified at just the idea of women being powerful, which back then in history wasn't really a thing, you know? Usually women were seen as the subservient sex, if you would, you know? So I guess the rest of the Greeks are just like, oh, women? Like, being powerful? We can't have this, you know? Yeah, this video's turning into, like, a feminist video. I'm joking. But, yeah, I gotta respect the hustle, man. Make your money, do what you want. Sounds like a pretty successful life, man.
So the Spartans were ridiculously wealthy, but even after hundreds of years, they still obsessively thought of themselves as foreign occupiers. In their minds, they were always just one misstep away from the total destruction of their civilization. For this reason, the Spartans placed an extremely high importance on prophecy and omens. Managing a bunch of sometimes contradictory prophecies can be a full-time job, so each king had 2 attendants to keep track of all of this. If one of the kings had a question for one of the oracles in the region, such as the Oracle of Delphi or Delphi, they would send one of these attendants to go and ask it for them.
You know, that's so interesting about the Oracle of Delphi. So in this semester right now, the recording of this video is like December 5th. I'm like, this is my last day of this fall semester of 2024 for my, I'm currently getting my English, my bachelor's for English, and you know, essentially that we had to, for my mythology class, we had to read Ovid's Metamorphoses. Um, and I did a presentation back in like September or August about the Oracle of Delphi, you know, which was said to be an oracle from Apollo, and you know, a very it was cool because that position transcends mythology into like reality, because there were actual oracles of Delphi who, and probably among in ancient times, one of the most powerful positions a woman could hold. You know, usually like women like 50 or older and were said to talk to the gods, and like famous people went to go speak with them. Just like a lot, there's a lot to it, I think. So I'm glad he brought that up. I have a huge fascination for Greek culture, by the way. I think it's like my favorite culture to study. I know we cover a lot of the Romans here, a lot of videos like that, and you probably get the impression that I'm overly obsessed with Rome. I mean, I do love Rome, don't get me wrong, but I'm actually, I would say my two favorite topics in history are the medieval era and Greece. Those are my two favorite topics to learn about. And yeah.
So, in a sense, the kings were the chief religious officials in the city. Their presence served as a religious justification for the city's continued existence, which was central to Spartan religious life. But in a practical sense, the city continued to exist because of Sparta's incredible military prowess. Strictly speaking, the kings were the only two people allowed to lead Sparta's armies. While one of the kings was on campaign, he basically transformed into an absolute monarch. His word was law. He held life and death power over every Spartan citizen, and could even confiscate property if he deemed it necessary for the war effort. The Spartan kings were entitled to a portion of everything that was captured in battle, but this didn't necessarily make them super wealthy. Being king was an expensive job. As I said before, the kings regularly, you might even say compulsively, consulted with oracles. When doing this, the kings were expected to make a king-sized donation to the host temple. To shortchange the temple would be to directly insult that temple's god. This was unthinkable to the superstitious Spartans. The kings had another massive expense, often overlooked. When on campaign, they had to bring some of their personal livestock with them to make animal sacrifices before virtually every important decision. If, after the sacrifice, the omens were still bad, the king had to continue making sacrifices until the omens changed. Slaughtering this many animals meant that while on campaign, the kings would just be hemorrhaging money. Animal sacrifices became so frequent that at one point, to ensure that the kings never ran out, there was a law passed that said that one piglet from every litter had to be taken and added to the king's personal livestock.
Yeah. So apparently, superstition, religion is what is making the kings poorer than they could be. They weren't giving so much money to the temples and killing their animals and livestock for omens. Yeah. Wow.
Insane number of pigs. I mentioned a law being passed. The kings had nothing to do with that. Their jobs were religious and military, and that's it. Governance was left to others.
Sorry about that. Come here, girl.
Who are you?
The people in Sparta who actually wrote the legislation were called the ephors. Their name translates as something like the overseers, and why the Spartans called them that will become clear in a minute. Sparta had 5 ephors, each at least 45 years old, and each elected for a 1-year term. Once an Ephor had served his term, he was barred from ever serving again. I say elected, but it was more complicated than that. We don't have a complete picture of exactly how this worked, but from what we can tell, the Spartans popularly elected an unknown number of candidates, and then 5 of those elected were chosen at random to serve as Ephors for that year. In other words, we know that the selection process was randomized to a degree, but we don't know to what degree. Were there 10 candidates to choose from, or 100? We have no idea. Aristotle says that this office usually went to relatively poor Spartans, and if that's true, there may have been a lot of randomness at play. At the beginning of the Spartan New Year, when the Ephors assumed office, they immediately renewed Sparta's war against the Helots in an elaborate ceremony. The whole thing served as a reminder to all Spartans that they were not native to this land, and that in theory, they were in a state of perpetual warfare against their own slaves. In practice, the Spartans used this state of war to justify all sorts of atrocities toward the Helot population, who, from what we can tell, did nothing to deserve any of it. I would encourage—
Yo, that's insane. Yo, the poor Helots, man. I just find it funny that they don't think that's their home. They see themselves as foreign. That's so weird to me, but such a unique viewpoint to have, especially after you've been there for like countless centuries. You're like, this still isn't our home, like, you know? Man, I don't know, man, like, yeah, I just feel like that's so insane. Like, it really does seem like the Helots, I know Sparta's decline, mainly, you know, after the Thebans defeated them, and then from then on, they just kind of super decline. But, I've never heard of a Helot revolt. There must have been one, right? At least one. I don't know.
I encourage you to go and look some of this stuff up. It's chilling. So on their first day, the Ephors singled out the Helots.
It also seems like a unique way to I guess, thin the herd, I'm assuming, of the Helots, like, justification for thinning the herd, killing, just to keep them a little bit less powerful. I'm guessing, I don't know. That's just a huge assumption I just made.
What did they do for the rest of the year? What did they oversee? They oversaw the kings. At the beginning of each new month, the 2 kings and the 5 Ephors would get together and exchange the following oaths. The kings would say to the Ephors, "I will reign according to the established laws of the state." And the Ephors would answer, "While you abide by your oath, we will keep the kingship unshaken." Kingship unshaken, what does that mean? The Ephors had an incredible amount of power to exercise oversight. If the king was acting in a way they didn't like, they could hold a vote, and with a straight majority of 3-2, they could formally charge a king with a crime. If a king was charged, there would be a trial. The Ephors were responsible for collecting and presenting the evidence, and then they would join forces with another body called the Gerousia to serve together as a jury. I'll talk about them later.
You can put the king on trial? Dang, like, guys, I don't know. I did not know about the intricacies of Spartan government so much. Even the idea that they had 2 kings. I mean, I've heard that there were 2 kings, but I didn't know that was the regular. I always assumed Sparta just had, like, usually just 1 king. But this is just unique to me. It's like, what? Can you, like, execute a king or just completely remove him if he's guilty? Like, wow. This is like an interesting balance of power, and it is so weird to me. Such a unique society. Yo, I bet the Athens video we're gonna watch next is gonna be insane too.
If a king was found guilty, a bunch of things could happen. On one end of the spectrum, he could be fined, and on the other, he could be stripped of the crown and banished from Sparta. In the case of banishment, the crown simply passed to the next in line to the throne. Remember, according to the Spartans, Heracles himself had given their kings the right to rule this land. Removing a king was bad enough, but they would never upset the line of succession. But the removal of a king was a rare occurrence. Even if a king was stuck with a group of hostile ephors, they were going to be gone in a year. The kings would have been savvy enough to know when to keep a low profile and wait for their enemies to leave office. But during wartime, the kings couldn't hide. They needed to be out, leading Sparta's armies. And when they were on campaign, 2 ephors went with them. 2 is an important number here. 2 ephors couldn't do anything on their own. They couldn't charge the king with a crime or interfere in any way with the conduct of the war. But they could take notes and report to the ephors back home what they saw. Once hostilities had ceased, together they could decide if the king had overstepped his bounds. But during normal stretches of time, when Sparta was not at war, the ephors spent most of their time writing policy. Simple votes were taken between the 5 ephors, and with a simple majority of 3, a proposal was approved. There were virtually no constraints on what they could dream up, but just because something got the approval of the ephors didn't mean that it became law. There was a mechanism for that, and we'll cover it later. Debates about taxes and spending obviously took up a lot of their time, but so did basic rules about morality and Spartan lifestyle. Once the ephors agreed on a piece of legislation, they would present it before an assembly of all male Spartan citizens. Once they heard the proposal, the Spartans would verbally vote yay or nay. No amendments, no discussion, just yay or nay. So if you want to summarize what we have so far, the 2 kings served as Sparta's religious figureheads and military leaders, while the 5 ephors provided oversight and passed legislation with the consent of the people. There were also a bunch
I've never heard of the ephors, and the kings just do seem like figureheads. I mean, obviously, in times of war, but even then they're not safe. Like, if they apparently overstep with the ephors, they can get removed at worst, but wow, that's so crazy to me. That 5 guys for a year could rule, and I'm just wondering, what if a new set of ephors by the next year don't like what was before? Could they just remove past legislation? I don't know. It's just very interesting. Like I said, I didn't know about this guy, so I'm really liking this so far.
Of smaller things that the ephors had control over. They got to decide who was allowed into and out of Spartan territory. This included merchants and diplomats and curious writers like Xenophon, whose work was crucial in the research for this video. Xenophon was able to live in Sparta for several years, striking up a close friendship with one of the kings. But even for Xenophon, his future in Sparta was always uncertain. Every year, new ephors came to power, and every year they re-evaluated whether or not they would allow this foreigner to live in their midst. The ephors were always reluctant to send Spartans abroad, even if there was a good reason for it. This is because Spartans had a reputation for going hog wild once they were away from home. We're talking out of control drinking, gambling, whoring, fighting. It was like a Spartan Rumspringa. Spartans were very good at living under their strict code of conduct in their own communities, but once they were out on their own, anything was up for grabs. What else did the ephors do? Well, they took an active role in the education of children. When a group of boys graduated into adulthood, the ephors picked 3 from the graduating class who, in their opinion, had outperformed their peers and best exemplified Spartan values. These 3 boys were each then allowed to pick 100 of their peers, with the ephors scrutinizing and questioning each selection along the way. When it was all done, the 3 boys selected by the ephors became officers, and each boy's 100 selections became their subordinates. Together, they became the royal guard to one of the kings. As soon as the ephors completed their 1 year—
Dang, that's so much power. It's just the 1 year limit is what's insane to me. Just a group of random guys for, every year. Wow, that's so interesting. That's such an interesting term limit. I mean, we've heard of many term limits, I think, with the Romans, right? A year or 2 or something, but yeah, that's just so much power to hold for such a short time, You're basically the government for a year. You and 5 guys, I don't know.
year term, they were hauled in before their successors to account for everything that they had done during their year in power. Basically, they had to undergo a formal review. If any of them were found to be abusing their power, their successors had the ability to punish them in any way they saw fit. The randomized selection process and the 1-year terms of the ephors could have introduced a lot of instability into the Spartan system, but this review mechanism discouraged the ephors from trying anything too radical, maybe to a fault. Every surviving account of the ephors is missing something important. There are no stories of any significant legislative accomplishments. None. That's weird, right? There could be a few reasons for this. Maybe everybody was scared of this formal review process at the end of the year. Or maybe it happened, but nobody was there to write it down. As it is, our sources are super patchy, and the only reason we know half of this stuff is because Xenophon happened to be pals with one of the kings. Or maybe the ephors were constrained by an external group.
The best deals of the year are just a click away during Cyber Week at Living Spaces, where you can shop online at Living Spaces.
That is so interesting. I might just go with the first idea. I think that definitely, they didn't want to face those ramifications. But who knows, right?
That brings us to the Gerousia. The Gerousia provided a check on the power of the ephors, which we'll get into in a minute. Gerousia means something like the Council of Elders, and it was made up of 28 members. The 2 kings were also honorary members, bringing its official number up to 30. Apart from the 2 kings, members of the Gerousia had to be men over the age of 60, and were expected to be men of merit and accomplishment. In practice, they seemed to all come from the same small circle of wealthy, well-connected families. This was an elected position, but unlike the ephors, these ones were held for life. When a member died, there seems to have been an intense competition for the open spot. It's hard to be certain, but some scholars believe that political factions rose up around the 2 royal houses, and that each faction jockeyed to get their candidate elected. So what did the Gerousia do? This body was allowed to set aside any decision that was approved by the assembly of Spartan citizens. In other words, they had veto power. The ephors could write the legislation, the Spartan citizens could approve it, and at the last minute, the Gerousia could step in and be like, nah, we're good. They could even take it one step further. The Gerousia set the agenda for every meeting of the assembly, which meant that the ephors could have all of this lovely legislation written, and all the Gerousia had to do was say, no, that's not going on the schedule. Since the ephors only served for 1 year, the Gerousia could easily block them until a new batch was elected. As you can imagine, the Gerousia had a significant conservative influence on the Spartan political culture. Reforms were not going to happen unless the Gerousia was on board. When an assembly of Spartan citizens were voting, the Gerousia had a super weird job. Members of the Gerousia would sit in another building, not far from the proceedings. The ephors would preside over the meeting and present their legislation, and the people would vote on it. Again, voting was done verbally. The Gerousia, sitting a short distance away, could not see what was going on, but they could hear the voting. After the vote, the Gerousia would come forward and announce which side was louder. The louder side won the vote. The idea was that this would keep the Gerousia impartial, but I mean, they were still allowed to veto the results if they didn't like them. As I mentioned before, if a king was on trial, or a citizen was on trial for a serious crime, like murder, the ephors and the Gerousia joined forces to form a 35-person jury. Presumably, since the kings were honorary members of the Gerousia, they got to be on the jury to their own trial. Weird. A simple majority decided the result, and since the elected members of the Gerousia held 28 of the 35 seats on the jury, they always held the balance of power. Just in case anything they did ever went to trial, the kings liked to informally consult with the Gerousia before any major decision. It made the old men feel important, and if the Ephors ever decided to come after the king, it was always nice to know that he had acted with the Gerusia's consent. Sparta was a notoriously cautious and conservative state, and it's clear to me that the Gerusia was the primary institutional source of that caution. Writing centuries after Sparta's decline, the Roman politician Cicero, you know, that guy, heaped praise upon the Spartan system. He liked how the kings were always hyper-aware that they could be removed from office at a moment's notice. He liked how the Ephors had to justify all of their actions to their successors at the end of their term. He liked how powerful the Gerusia was, and how these wise old men could balance competing interests or shut down legislation if
It is a unique, like, balance of power and governmental system that Sparta has built for itself. And it lasted quite a while, you know, so, I don't know, that's just so fascinating. I didn't know any of this, guys, you know, and the Gerusia are such an interesting thing, because it kind of balances out, because I was like, the Ephors seemed like they couldn't really make some changes that they wanted to, but yeah, I don't know. That's just such a unique form of government that I haven't seen yet. You know, the position of the kings and all that, it is just so interesting.
things were getting out of hand. He thought that this was an incredibly stable way to build institutions, and as a conservative, Cicero loved stability. Xenophon agreed, calling Spartan institutions and the stability they provided the source of its strength. But in the end, maybe it was too stable. At the height of its power, Sparta was able to mobilize its entire male citizenry into an army of at least 20,000, maybe more. 150 years later, in Alexander the Great's time, this number had shrunk to 1,000 men, for unknown reasons. This is why Alexander...
There's one account of a catastrophic earthquake killing thousands of Spartans, but this alone does not explain the city's decline. Yeah, you know, like I've heard them losing to the Thebans kind of removed the Spartan hegemony, and from then on they never fully recovered. At least in terms of losing, you know, that. And yeah, but like again, Sparta wasn't like it didn't have like, I mean, 20,000 ain't bad, but you know, in the, I don't know, I was about to say it's low, but then again, I have to take into account the time, you know, but yeah, but to just shrink to 1,000 is insane. I could see why Alexander didn't bother with them when he went around conquering. He was like, I think even Alexander had a famous saying, like, he and the Greeks are gonna go do something, but not the Spartans. Like, he specifically calls out Sparta for not being there or something. But yeah, like, why would you? Like, the Spartans were past their prime at that point, you know? But it's funny because Sparta did revolt, and then like one of Alexander's like commanders or subordinates just went in. Alexander sent the B team, essentially, and they wrecked Sparta, so you can see why Alexander didn't like personally bother, right? Or like even Philip, right?
The Great's father, Philip, felt comfortable shrugging off Spartan threats. 150 years after that, when the Romans started getting their hands dirty in Greece, Sparta was nothing more than an insignificant village, a curiosity, still living under kings and ephors and the Gerusia, and still observing their strict ancient customs. The causes of this precipitous decline are not known to us, but maybe, over the course of those 300 years, a key reform or two could have triggered a recovery. Maybe increasing the immigration rate from 0 would have helped. Maybe they could have offered citizenship to a certain number of Helot slaves. Maybe they could have relaxed their strict marriage laws. You know, reforms, ideas, solve the problem. This is what governments are for. Despite their worst fears, the Spartan invaders were never overthrown by a Helot uprising, or by a coalition of angry Greeks. Instead, they allowed themselves to wither and atrophy, only to be conquered by another set of invaders who saw them as nothing more than a bunch of archaic freaks left over from a more illustrious time.
Wow, so Sparta didn't go out with a bang. They went out with like a whimper, right? Essentially. Wow, that's so interesting. This was a great video, guys. I love this. I really love the way Historia Civilis breaks down the way government works, because for some reason he makes it interesting. Like, I'm never bored when he's explaining the governmental policies. Like, the dude made land reforms in the Julius Caesar video interesting. And I'm thinking, like, who cares about land reforms? I mean, you know, it's like, it's not a fun topic to cover, you know? So, yeah, like, he has a unique gift of breaking down governments, and, like, breaking it down in a way that's easy. Like, I process his government videos of the way he explains them, and I just get it. Like, he has a weird way of making it entertaining, engaging, and easy to absorb and learn from. Like, I don't know, you have a real gift, Historia Civilis. Like, you really do. And I guess I'm gonna have to jump to the Constitution of Athens next. So I guess I'll see you tomorrow on that one, guys. Till then, bye everyone.